straight ahead on Law and Crime Daily. Derek Chauvin found guilty of all 3 charges in the death of George Floyd.
Bail is revoked, bond is discharged, and the defendant is remanded to the custody of the Hennepin County Sheriff.
How the final words from the attorneys could have impacted the jury's decision.
Human beings make decisions in highly stressful situations that they believe to be right.
The reason George Floyd is dead is because Mr. Chauvin's heart was too small.
Plus, the defense's motion for mistrial after a representative calls for protesters to be confrontational if there's not a guilty verdict.
I wish elected officials would stop talking about this case.
And why Derek Chauvin wants the judge, not the jury, to decide if he should receive a sentence higher than state guidelines.
I'm willing to waive it and have Judge Cahill decide on those issues.
Law and Crime Daily, covering court cases from coast to coast. Welcome to Law and Crime Daily. I'm Angelica Spanos in our studios. Brian Buckmire is in Minneapolis covering the Derek Chauvin trial. And with us, as always, is Terri Austin. Well, the jury has reached a verdict for the former officer charged in the death of George Floyd. Let's get right to it.
We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. Same caption, verdict count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. Same caption, verdict count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty.
Here are those charges for you. Guilty of second-degree murder, guilty of second-degree manslaughter, and guilty of third-degree murder. 12 members plus 2 alternates heard the case. Judge Cahill dismisses the 2 alternates, both female, before heading into the deliberations. 7 women and 5 men make up the jury. 6 identify as white, 4 as black, and 2 as mixed race. Their ages range from in their 20s to in their 60s. Brian, I want to come out to you first. Your immediate reaction to this verdict.
As I was sitting there listening in my earphones as to when the verdict was coming up, I then got up and started walking around outside of the Hennepin County Government Center where people were congregating. It started with 50 people, then 100 people, then 150, and it kept growing and growing. And as Judge Cahill came out and started to read the verdict, there was a kind of sense of calm as he went through the numbers of the charges and finally got to that guilty for the top charge. There was a cheer. Then a second cheer as to the second guilty, and a third cheer as to the guilty on the third count. And it seemed that just everyone just breathed a sigh of relaxing a little bit, because the anxiety of waiting to see what would happen was really pent up. And I think my reaction would be is that Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd. It's no longer a killing. It's no longer alleged. It's no longer accused. He murdered George Floyd. And I think people finally see that some justice was found here.
All right, Brian, and in here in New York, when the verdict was read, you hear from inside the studios, we heard horns honking and cheering outside here around Herald Square, too. Terri, you know, the jury deliberated for 10 and a half hours. Do you find that that was relatively fast for this sort of case?
I did think it was fast because it's a complicated case. You have the 3 different charges, and the judge gave the elements on each of those charges. And you have to think that the jury has been listening to this evidence for a month now. So I think that they really cut to the chase. They looked at the 2 main issues, the fact that this was unreasonable force, the fact that the knee did cause his death and asphyxiation. So it came back quickly. There was cheering here in Harlem as well. And I think that there is an overall universal sigh of relief.
All right, Terri, Brian, thank you. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison spoke after the verdict, calling it just.
Here we are in 2021, still addressing the same problem. Since Dr. Clark testified, we have seen Rodney King, Abner Louima, Oscar Grant, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Laquan McDonald, Stephon Clark, Atiana Jefferson, Anton Black, Breonna Taylor, and now Dante Wright and Adam Toledo. This has to end. We need true justice. That's not one case. That is a social transformation that says that nobody's beneath the law and no one is above it. This verdict reminds us that we must make enduring, systemic, societal change.
And of course, prosecutors got the final word in closing arguments. Jerry Blackwell ending on this note for the jury.
But I wanted to save till the end what I thought was the biggest shading of the truth, or what I call story.
Object to that, Your Honor, and
You'll disregard the phrase shading the truth.
Well, here's what I thought then was the largest departure from here, the evidence. I'll show it to you. You were told, for example, that Mr. Floyd died. That Mr. Floyd died because his heart was too big. You heard that testimony. And now, having seen all the evidence, having heard all the evidence, you know the truth. And the truth of the matter is that the reason George Floyd is dead is because Mr. Chauvin's heart was too small.
Jerry Blackwell covered multiple points there, Terry, during that rebuttal. Curious which points stood out to you?
Well, I thought that he was very eloquent when he said about the heart. He also had phrases like reasonable is as reasonable does. He said that Chauvin did not let up. He did not get up. But the 2 points that he really made that he had to make in that rebuttal were as to the cause of death and as to unreasonable force. Nelson said that the state had to prove that none of the other factors played a role. Jerry Blackwell clarified that the state only has to show that the defendant's actions were a substantial factor. And then he also showed that for reasonable force, Nelson said that the state had to prove that Chauvin intended to act unlawfully. Jerry Blackwell made it very clear that they only had to prove that he intended to do what he did. So he made some important rebuttal points, some minor points as well, but overall I thought he did an excellent job.
All right, Terry. And Brian, what do you think was the best piece of evidence that the jury saw during the trial?
I think it was the video. I think that the prosecution lined up their arguments, lined up the elements of the crime way better than Eric Nelson did. And I think when the jury went back and saw what the elements were, saw what the instructions were, they were closer to what the prosecution was arguing and closer to what they saw with their very own eyes on that video. I think at the end of the day, this case would not have been what it was but for Donald Williams and those who recorded what was seen. Yeah, body cam video is great, but the video, the point of view from the bystanders who didn't choose to be witnesses, but were selected by happenstance. And what we saw in that video, I think the world saw, the jury saw, and that's why we got the conviction that we heard moments ago.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people would agree with you there, Brian. Still ahead on Law and Crime Daily, Rodney Floyd speaking out in the name of his brother, George Floyd. And first, our exclusive interview with the man seen with George Floyd on the day he died. What Maurice Hall had to say about the verdict coming up next. With George Floyd on the day he died, pleaded the fifth during Derek Chauvin's trial. Law and Crime's Angenette Levy spoke with him just minutes after the verdict was read. The first time he spoke to anyone after the verdict, actually. Angenette, tell us what he told you.
Yeah, Angelica, Maurice Hall was really supposed to be a key witness for the defense in this case since he was in the SUV with George Floyd the night that he died and when police approached. But he ended up invoking his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and not testifying. He actually feared he could be charged with third-degree murder for possibly providing drugs to Floyd that night. He showed up at the courthouse for the reading of the verdict, and we spoke with him.
I wanted to make sure that if it was a guilty trial, that I want to promote positive protests and not burn the city down if we could. That was my main motion of really being out here today.
You were there when this happened that night. What was kind of going through your head when you were standing there with Shawanda Hill and Officer Chang, and this was all going on across the street?
Allegedly, I had no thoughts at the time. I was numb. I couldn't. I was being detained. That's like the world saw. I couldn't really have any emotions at that time.
And Maurice Hall had watched some of the trial, actually. He was incarcerated for most of the trial, but then posted bail. He had some other cases going on, some criminal cases, and I asked him what he thought about how that prosecution case unfolded.
Prosecution done a great job, and it was the right thing to do. We all saw it. We all witnessed it.
Tell me about George Floyd. How long did you know him?
I've been knowing Floyd like 20, 21 years. Floyd was life, full of life. You know, you didn't have to have much to be in his presence and still have fun. You know, he's a sense of humor, great sense of humor guy. He's a giver. You know, most people adders, subtractors, and dividers. Floyd was an adder, definitely. He added to your life, whether it was physical presence and he can help, or just his security, or his words of encouragement, wisdom, you know, like the brother just an all-around team player, athlete.
And I asked Hall, after he made mention of, he said, I will be at the other trial for the other 3 officers in August. And I asked him, well, what do you mean you're going to be there? Are you going to be testifying? Are you getting immunity? And he kind of clammed up when I asked him that question and referred me to his attorney. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds in the upcoming trial for the other 3 officers later in August. Angelica?
Absolutely, Angenette. And, you know, he seemed pretty comfortable talking to you, and it was really a casual conversation he had with you right there in front of a lot of people who are out there for this trial. I mean, what was your reaction to him even speaking to you? He even said he might want to write a book about all this.
Yeah, he did say that, and it was actually pretty interesting because I just kind of looked over. I was walking around after the verdicts were read, and I was walking around, and I literally looked, and I thought to myself, I think that's Maurice Hall. And I went up and I said, are you Maurice Hall? And he said, yes, I am. And I said, well, can I talk to you? And he came over to the camera. I had talked to him before we went on camera. His lawyer and his PR representative wouldn't let him answer my questions about what happened that night, what was going on in the car. They were like, no, you can't talk about that. But he was willing to talk about other things. So he kind of knows the score.
All right, Angenette, thank you. Great reporting there. Terri, you know, the jury came to this verdict without asking a single question during this. And this, as we know, is a confusing process. Now, they didn't ask any questions, but they did come to this verdict in, again, about 10 and a half hours. Do you think that this shows that they were focused? What do you think?
They were definitely focused. You know, they had a lot of evidence that they had to look over. This trial really began with the jury selections back on March 9th, and they've been listening to evidence for weeks now and multiple witnesses, 45 different witnesses. So I think they really cut to the chase. They understood what the 2 main issues were, and they came to a great conclusion here that really satisfied the world, I believe.
Absolutely. All right, Terri, Angenette, thank you both. Coming up next on Law and Crime Daily, Kristen Smart's accused killer is behind bars after 26 years, his plea in court, and Rodney Floyd's message for everyone in the memory of his brother, George Floyd. That's all straight ahead after this. Emergency was declared in the Twin Cities in anticipation of the verdict in the Derek Chauvin trial. Emotions running extremely high there all day as the nation waited for this verdict. We know that hundreds of students walked out of class this week to protest racial injustice. City schools closed buildings and put distance learning in place, all out of safety precautions. And on top of that, thousands of National Guard soldiers are guarding grocery stores, post offices, laundromats, and other landmarks. Meanwhile, civil rights leaders like Al Sharpton are in town holding press conferences, standing shoulder to shoulder with Floyd's family members, praying another black man won't die at the hands of police.
So many people stepped up in this city, standing up for George, standing up for what's right, what they believe in, because they want to make sure their family members not another hashtag.
George Floyd was killed on May 25th of last year. I came a week later to Minneapolis and did the eulogy at his funeral. It's not even a year later, and this Thursday, I'll be doing the eulogy for Dante Wright in Minneapolis. This is why this trial is so important.
And Brian, you know, you've been there throughout the whole trial. What's the feeling on the ground there now post-verdict? We know that the Attorney General is asking for a legal and, of course, peaceful celebrations. How is it there now?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you can hear, but it's just a lot of honking as people drive by. It's almost celebratory. People are honking, they're cheering. The protest that was outside after the conviction of Derek Chauvin was one of celebration, but also one of this isn't the end. This is the beginning. People are starting to take notice of these types of incidents involving police violence, and they want to move forward with more justice.
All right, Brian, thank you for your reporting there coming out of Minneapolis. So important that you have been there throughout the trial. When we come back, we will show you how prosecutors are trying to get a higher sentence for Derek Chauvin. The judge to decide the sentence, not the jury. That is what he is asking. That's coming up. Welcome back. A new report says the Capitol police officer who died following the January 6th riot died of natural causes. Officer Brian Sicknick was involved in a confrontation with rioters at the Capitol building. The Washington, D.C. chief medical examiner now says the 42-year-old died as a result of multiple strokes at the base of his brainstem. This is according to the Washington Post. The autopsy also shows there was no evidence of external or internal injuries to the officer. Capitol Police released a statement saying, quote, "This does not change the fact that he died in the line of duty." Sicknick collapsed in his office and died a few hours after the protests. And the father and son accused in the disappearance and alleged cover-up of a California college student in 1996 are pleading not guilty. Cal Poly State University student Kristen Smart seemingly vanished 24 years ago after leaving a party. Her ex-classmate Paul Flores is now charged with murdering her. His father, Ruben Flores, is charged as an accessory for allegedly helping to hide her body. Smart's body is yet to be recovered, but investigators say they're hopeful they will find it. An attorney for Ruben Flores told the judge the most damning evidence was disturbed soil police found in his client's backyard, saying that he could provide an innocent explanation for it. Ruben Flores is due back in court for a motion to reduce his bond on Wednesday. And back now to the Derek Chauvin courtroom. The defendant waived his right to a jury, deciding whether he should receive a higher aggravated sentence.
I have specifically advised you that you have a right to have a jury decide whether or not the state has proven those grounds for an aggravated sentence beyond a reasonable doubt. You have a right to have a jury decide if you violate it, right?
Correct.
And I've advised you that the state has to prove those grounds beyond a reasonable doubt.
Correct.
And we can waive that right and allow, if you're convicted, we can waive your right to a trial and allow the judge to make those determinations. I've advised you about that, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, do you want a jury to make a decision about the proof required for the aggravated factors if there's a conviction, or are you willing to waive your right to a trial on those matters and allow Judge Cahill to make those decisions?
I'm willing to waive it and have Judge Cahill decide on those issues.
All right, Terri, this is the second time the judge has personally spoken to Derek Chauvin. Why do you think it was important for the judge to talk to him about waiving his Blakely rights?
Well, you saw there, Angelica, that not only did Nelson talk to his client, but it is important for the judge to speak to the client, because he has to make sure that the client understands that he's waiving his rights. The first time was when he waived his right to take the stand, and this time he waived his right to have the jury decide the aggravating factors and to let the judge decide that. So it's important that he understands, not only from his own attorney, but the judge wants to make sure that he clearly understands those rights.
All right, Terri, thank you. Brian, what do you expect the defense might do now that we have the verdict? What's their next move? Maybe appeals? What do you think?
The next move is sentencing. What Derek Chauvin with his attorney Eric Nelson has got to do is try to drive that sentencing number as low as possible. Yes, appeals are going to be coming, but first, the first step here is what's the number? We know the top count comes with 40 years in jail, but those 4 aggravating factors that were raised by the prosecution, the fact that a crime occurred in front of minors, the fact that he was particularly vulnerable, the fact that this was cruel, and the fact that 3 or more people participated in a crime are all factors that Eric Nelson has to push back on and try to find some reasonable doubt. I think it's going to be difficult to try to get a lower sentence.
All right, Brian, thank you for that reporting. Thank you all for joining us here on Law and Crime Daily. We'll see you next time as we discuss justice in America.